Good afternoon. I'm Desiree Dembski-Hamlin, Deputy Director of Freedom's Way National Heritage Area. On behalf of Freedom's Way, I'd like to welcome you to Laying the Groundwork for Environmental and Place-Based Education, a conversation with author and educator David Sobel. The first session in our third webinar series, Using Environmental and Place-Based Education to Engage with Families. I'd like to thank Freedom's Way board member Susie Fonda for organizing this series and David for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Freedom's Way National Heritage Area works with partners across 45 communities in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Our mission is to promote, protect, and enhance the natural, cultural, and historical resources of those communities. Since November, we have offered a number of webinar series to encourage the development of family programs leading up to our annual Hidden Treasures program taking place during May. This year, it has been reimagined as the Hidden Treasures Festival of Nature, Culture, and History, featuring in-person events, self-guided opportunities, virtual offerings, and more. So stay tuned. And for those of you working with an organization or community, we hope you'll consider partnering with us during this program. So a few housekeeping items. Attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar series, the session. Questions and answers will be taken at various points during the presentation. So if anything comes to mind, please type it into the chat and Susie will make sure that those are answered when appropriate. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our facilitator for today's session, Susie Fonda. Susie is a Freedom's Way board member and an educator with 15 years of experience in museums, including the Concord Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Plymouth Patuxent Museums, formerly known as Plymouth Plantation. Welcome, Susie.
Thanks, Desiree. And thank you to you and to Patrice for setting up this webinar. So happy to see you all here today on this day when it doesn't seem like the best day to be outside, to be talking about being outside. As we're starting to move towards spring and the days are getting longer, we thought that this would be a great opportunity to take it outside and to do a webinar where we can think about ways to engage families and children in environmental education and in place-based education. And as the first part of this webinar, we're so thrilled to have David Sobel with us. And just to tell you a little bit about David, David Sobel has written extensively on the topic of children and hands-on education and play in nature. His numerous books, from Wild Play, Parenting Adventures in the Great Outdoors, to place-based education, connecting classrooms and communities, and to childhood in nature, design principles for educators, plus other works focusing on different age levels, offer parents and teachers insights into the value, appeal, and techniques of outdoor experiences for personal, physical, and social growth. Sobel is a professor emeritus in the education department at Antioch University, New England. He consults and lectures nationally and internationally on place-based education, children's relationship with nature, and nature-based early childhood education. And there's no one better to talk about this topic with us today. So please join me in welcoming David Sobel.
Thanks, Susie. My wife always refers to this time of year as taint season, which means it taint winter and it taint spring. And so, yes, I think this is a good day to be indoors doing a webinar, though I would prefer to be outdoors if it was nice. My focus is going to be on environmental and place-based education and families. I'm going to do some sociological portrait research on where kids and families are at in relationship to nature nowadays. By nowadays, I don't necessarily mean the pandemic days, but I mean the current days and hopefully in post-pandemic days. And then I'm going to talk about some of the childhood and nature design principles and then illustrate them with examples of family engagement programs that I'm familiar with. So I think I'm going to do it in half. First half, then take a couple of questions in the second half. Okay, the slides are going to show up later for you than they do for me, so hopefully I won't start talking before the slide shows up. So this is a wonderful a quote from a parenting magazine article from now quite a decade or more ago, when the mom says, "I want to stand in the front yard and sing out their lovely names at dusk," referring to her children's names, "and have them suddenly appear in the damp yard around me like fireflies, but I can't let them roam. I don't have my mother's confidence that the world is a safe place." And this is something I think we're all familiar with, and especially don't feel like the world is a safe place right now. So the reasons for outdoor diminishing play before the pandemic and even after the pandemic have been these things: the increase of screen time. Kids spend 8 hours a day engaged with screens and half an hour outdoors, if that. There's lots of structured activities for kids. There's two working parents or two working, people that take care of the kids. So kids are staying indoors. There's homework, there's fear of injuries. Parents don't want their kids outdoors because their kids are going to get injured, though more children are injured falling out of bed than falling out of trees. And then there's this whole concern about stranger danger, which I think, is exaggerated in terms of the actual danger that children are subject to. And children are the most dangerous thing we do every day with kids is put them in a car. So that means, because of all those anxieties, we're seeing much less of that top image and lots more of that bottom image, especially nowadays. And yet, when you ask children, 94% of children want to spend more time outside, and 86% of parents say on a nice day they'd prefer to go to the park than watch TV, right? So that everybody wants to be doing this. So how do we make it happen? This is a good indication of what's happened over the last, this was over 4 generations in one British family. And so what this is a map of children's range. Children's range meaning how far can a child travel on their own without parental supervision. So that really big kind of triangle-shaped blob was the great-grandfather's range in 1919, like a century ago, when he was 8 years old. And he could walk 6 miles from his home to the Rother Valley to go fishing. His son, Jack, who was 8 in 1950, was able to walk a mile on his way into the woods. That's a little circle to the left of the big triangle shape. The mom, who was aged 8 in 1979, was allowed to walk to the swimming pool, which was a half a mile away. And then the son, aged 8 in what was then about 2010, I think, could walk on his own to the end of his street. So over the course of 4 generations, the child's range, the ability to go out and ramble freely in the countryside, had constricted by a substantial amount. Now, this was also true in Wilmington, Vermont, but over the course of only about 40 years. So in the 1970s, Roger Hart did similar kind of research with children in Wilmington, Vermont. And then he went back about 5 or 6 years and did research, and this exactly the same thing had happened in England over the course of those 4 generations. Children's range had decreased by about 90%. And this was, in Wilmington, Vermont, has not really changed that much in the intervening 40 years, right? It's not that much more traffic. There's not that many more, there's not more abductions. The only thing that probably has changed is the number of ticks. Not much has changed except for parental anxiety about their children's safety. So Roger Hart, there's a fear among parents that's exaggerated beyond what the actual dangers are, right? So this whole notion of parental anxiety restricting children's range and exploration. And so as a result, there's lots more of that, what children are getting on that upper left-hand image, exploring freely in the woods, and much more of kids being either on leashes or on electronic tracking devices. So I'm going to share a little bit about the virtue of children and nature and play. So if families are having the experience of not allowing their children to be outdoors, then the opportunity then falls, or the responsibility falls to parks and nature museums and children's museums and historical sites to provide the kind of experiences that kids should be having, but aren't having because of this parental anxiety about, free range childhood. So one thing that we know really clearly is that physical activity leads to better health. And research has shown that when children are outdoors, it's much more likely that they're going to be twice as physically active as when they're indoors. So just having children outdoors means they're going to be twice as physically active. We also know that contact with nature increases mental well-being. So children with nature near their homes are more resistant to stress, have lower incidence of behavioral disorders and anxiety and depression, and have a higher measure of self-worth. There's also been research that shows that symptoms of children with attention deficit disorder are relieved after contact with nature. So some physicians are now prescribing green time, 1 hour a day for children. And some research has suggested that green time is equally as effective as drugs for attention deficit disorder. And so taking your kids to the park may be just as useful as having them take their Ritalin. This was research that was done in Scandinavia, again, now it's a little antiquated, there's been more recent research, but children who have better motor fitness when they participate in nature preschools, and they're sick less often. Now, this has been really clear this year during the pandemic, is that lots of schools have moved children outdoors for a significant portion of the day because of the decreased likelihood of viral transmission in outdoor settings. So this was true before the pandemic, is that if you had kids outdoors more, they're less likely to convey flu or other kinds of germs to kids, and they wind up being healthier. So this idea that, we can't take the children outside because they'll get sick, it might be just the opposite. We can't keep the children indoors because they'll get sick. And outdoor play encourages collaboration. So children who play in nature have more positive feelings about each other. And so here's another interesting reason for outdoor play. This was research that was done with rats when they were fed a bacteria that's common in dirt. The rats navigated complex mazes twice as fast as those that were not fed the same bacteria. And so it could be that children playing outdoors and being in contact with dirt is actually a good thing. This has led to the creation of International Mud Day, where organizations create these giant mud puddles and children play in the mud. And there's this theory of childhood contact with the natural world, that the reason that kids put stuff into their mouths from about 6 months to a year or so is that they have this reflex, this inborn desire to put stuff into their mouths because it introduces the local flora and fauna into their immune systems, and their immune systems start to build up some resistance to them. So that there's this notion that the internalizing little bits of bacterial flora and fauna is part of children being healthy. So I'm waiting for one organization within Freedom's Way Heritage Area to create International Mud Day. It is a big international festival, just not that big in the United States. This makes me a little nervous looking at this picture. So the idea here is that what organizations like yours should be trying to do is creating this circle of friendship between children and the natural world. I'm going to entertain a question or two about what I've talked about thus far before I keep going.
One thing that I'm curious about is, so you have this issue of, parents who have anxiety about their kids going out, but there's all of this evidence that it's good for them. How do you get past that with parents? Are there arguments that are particularly more relevant, that can really help change people's minds, I guess?
Yeah, I think that one thing that it's important to do is to do parent and kid programs at historic sites or at nature areas or something like that, to have opportunities at points during a program. You've got a structured program, but then you have some open space, is you have some time where you allow kids to go and be off by themselves, within sight, but a little further away than you would normally do during a program. And so what you want to do is model letting kids have the free range experience, or it doesn't have to be a free range. It could be an experience where children are, self-directed play. So model that activity and model kind of stepping back some from it and allowing it to occur, and then talking with parents about the virtue of it. So I think if you model that, yeah, we feel okay about the children going down to this shallow stream and trying to catch frogs, or it's okay for children to go inside the barn. We know there's nothing dangerous in there. They can go inside the barn and look around. That kind of modeling is really useful.
One question is about in the history timeline map, what age was the child in the history timeline map? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, each of those children were about 8 or 9 years old. I've done a lot of research with children and range myself, and where I asked children to draw me a map of their neighborhood. And if children grow up in a fairly safe area where parents will allow them to roam, there is a big shift right around 8 or 9 years old. There's a big movement away. So the increased distance that kids want to be from home, that happens right around 8 or 9 years old. And so it's a biological disposition, I think.
And do you notice a difference at all between kids who are growing up in urban environments versus rural environments or suburban environments in terms of how they're able to interact with nature or the relationship to it?
Yeah, it's, some people are probably familiar with the whole notion of free range parenting, which this woman, I can't remember her name right at the moment. This woman who allowed her son was 9 years old. He really wanted more free, and they lived in New York City, Lower Manhattan. I think it was Lower Manhattan. He really wanted more freedom of travel within the city. And so they practiced this, and then they went to Bloomingdale's, and then she said, okay, now you're going to get home by yourself. He was 9 years old. And so he had a subway train, and then I think he had to take a bus, and then he had to walk 6 blocks. It was something like that. And she, and so she allowed him to do it. He got home. He was thrilled. She wrote an essay about it. And then she got lambasted by parents. So kids in cities want this same freedom. And but they have less, it's less likely that they're going to have it because of the greater sense of fear in cities. And in a lot of, in a lot of European cities and in Asian cities, it's not uncommon. And again, I'm talking pre or post pandemic. It's not uncommon for 6, 7, and 8-year-old children to travel on public transportation to school, or to, just use public transportation on their own. So there's a great preschool program in Atlanta where they actually do place-based education, and on a daily basis, they're city parks or getting on the metro to go visit museums or that kind of thing. So they're actually modeling that kind of, training kids to how to explore in cities, which is it's a good thing to do. So yes, it's more likely kids in rural areas are going to have the freedom to explore, but it's possible within urban areas.
There aren't as many, we think about these sort of stranger dangers, but how do you teach children about environmental dangers, things like ticks and mosquitoes and those types of things?
Yeah. I wrote an article, which I'd be happy to share with folks, about a teacher at a school in Maine where they had, kids were coming in from the playground with ticks on them all the time. And there was a lot of community and school fear around the whole tick thing. And then the teacher, who is a 3rd grade teacher, implemented a tick science curriculum where the kids became responsible for collecting ticks from all the children who had been on the playground, and then sexing them and figuring out what species they were, because there was both deer ticks and dog ticks, and then doing a really interesting little study to figure out where the ticks were most prevalent and which ticks were problematic. And it wound up, and then the kids did public presentations to the school community and to parents, and it wound up reducing the anxiety about it. So essentially the message is, you have to I say ticks are like brushing your teeth, right? Because you do it every day. It just becomes part of the habit. With ticks now, it just has to become habitual that, you do tick checks every day. If you live in a really ticky environment, and you start to understand which are dog ticks and which are deer ticks, because dog ticks are way less prevalent vectors than deer ticks are. So it's, one of those things you just got to do.
Yeah. That's a great way to think about it, as a learning opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So great. So so please keep your questions coming. But we'll have David resume his PowerPoint, and we'll join up again at the end.
So the big idea here is, over a number of years, I started to see patterns in the recurrent ways in which kids wanted to play in the natural world when they had free access to outdoors and parents that were willing to allow that free access. And I started to see these things not just in white suburban kids, but also in urban kids and in kids in other countries. And I gradually started to realize that there were a variety of genetically inclined play themes, things that kids wanted to do outdoors. So these were special places and hunting and gathering and small worlds and animal allies. I'll go into what I mean by these things. And so I said, so if this is what kids want to do, then let's turn them into design principles. And let's think of, when we're designing programs, let's think about how we can incorporate these play motifs as design principles to help us. And so therefore, kids will implicitly be more interested and engaged, since we're asking them to do the things that we know they inherently want to do. So I'm going to give you some examples of these things. So special places. If you get really interested, my first book is called Children's Special Places, and it goes into this in depth. So the whole tendency to create special places starts indoors and then moves outdoors. So it starts indoors as fort and blanket and picnic table kinds of forts. So this is my living room, you know, when my 4-year-old son had created this complex little labyrinth of forts in the living room. And I would come home every evening and the living room would once again be torn up. And I felt like I had created a monster by allowing this to happen. Other forms of children's interest in forts are where used to be, this is now a dying art in New England, is hay bale forts. So in baled hay in barns, kids would traditionally excavate, you know, pull out bales, move them around, and make hay bale forts. But since we now do those big rolls are not movable parts like hay bales were. On the coast of Maine or on any driftwoody shore, there's always fort building. And the crux idea here is loose parts. The theory of loose parts is an landscape architecture principle, which is that the more loose parts that are available in the environment, the better that environment is for play, for imaginative play and construction. So driftwood beaches are perfect loose parts places because there's driftwood and ropes and lots of other flotsam and jetsam. One of the greatest examples of loose parts play I found on an old quarry island on Green's Island in Penobscot Bay, where this was an old paved stone quarry, and there were tons of these small chunks of granite lying around. And so for half a dozen kids, they created this elaborate stone world, which was built with all these chunks of leftover granite from the quarrying industry. And they did just mind-boggling things with it. So, and these were just the right size chunks so that 9 and 10-year-old kids could pick them up and move them. So what's happening here is that in this middle childhood period is kids want to create homes away from home. They want to move out into the big world. And one of the ways they move out into the big world is to create a home out there. So an organization I'm on the board for, which is the Harris Center for Conservation Education in Hancock, New Hampshire, created a program called Forts, Shacks, and Shanties. And this is an after-school program in which kids would come once a week for a couple of hours and build different kinds of forts, shacks, and shanties, as well as doing knot tying and fire building and wild tool construction. So that was the environmental education organization saying, okay, if this forts thing is what kids want to do, let's do programming based on forts. And here are some examples of other kinds of special place of possibilities in parks and nature centers. Hollowed out logs, bean pole, teepees, and then bamboo cuttings, which you can cut to, have the loose parts to create places. So that was the special places design principle. This is hunting and gathering. So the other thing you see in children in middle childhood, in cultures all around this world, is the desire to hunt, to catch stuff and eat it, or catch stuff and collect it, and or gather fruits and vegetables. So, kids fishing in that upper left-hand image, children probably catching frogs or pollywogs or something in that lower right-hand image. Berry picking, really common fascination with children. Squirrel hunting. You can't really quite see that image with the girl with the orange hunting cap on, but she's holding a squirrel by its tail. And I did research on an island in the Caribbean with children, and they would draw me maps of their neighborhoods, and then I would go on field trips with them. And 80% of the time, the field trips that the boys took me on were hunting field trips, and the field trips that the girls took me on were wild food scavenging field trips, and that was play for them. So one of the things that the Children in Nature Network has been advocating for is the creation of family adventure clubs, and these are once a week family and kid activities, and they in this case it's the adventure was to go pick strawberries. But in lots of cases, the idea is to just go to the nature center or the county park and go on a kind of loosely structured family adventure where nature play and being outdoors is allowed, and kids and parents are doing it together. And Susie, in terms of the question you asked before, these are opportunities to talk about risk and how far, how supervised do my children need to be. So this parent kid programming is a really good way to do this. There's even research that shows that children that hunt and gather with their kids in childhood are more likely to grow up to be adults who display environmental behaviors in adulthood. This is the Michigan Recreation and Parks Association does these kinds of programs. Sturgeon in the Classroom, great thing, but then they do these fishing programs for families and kids to teach kids to fish. This is true not just in Michigan, but a bunch of other state fish and game departments. This teaching kids to fish thing is a really good activity. So now I'm going to talk about maps and paths. This whole interest in middle childhood for children to figure out how their neighborhood fits together and what the shortcuts are from my house to the school or my house to my friend's house. And some kids have a tendency to actually, of their own volition, draw maps of their neighborhoods. But interesting, twisty networks of trails and paths for kids are really interesting. This is a combination of both hunting and gathering and the maps and paths idea. Valley Quest is something that's been going on in the Upper Valley. That's that section of New Hampshire and Vermont, kind of centered around White River Junction and Hanover and Norwich. It's about a 40-town area, somewhat similar to Freedom's Way in geographical span. And they've created this collection of what are essentially treasure hunts, and they consolidate them and put them in. There's 3 of these Valley Quest books, which are basically treasure hunt books, and they go to historical sites and natural sites and dams and children's museums, and then there's a treasure hunt there. You can find them. They're all online now, and they're all across this 45-town area. One of them in Claremont, New Hampshire, or the first page, which tells you how to get there, and it's basically it's focused on understanding some of the old mill history in Claremont, New Hampshire. And so each of these clues, actually the quests can take many different forms. One of the forms is this kind of rhymed couplet poetry format. So, and in a lot of these cases, these are written as part of school programs, as part of the curriculum in a 5th or 6th or 8th grade classroom. So it's part of learning about history through creating a quest in your town. So, kids have to, learn to do the kind of doggerel poetry to narrate a pathway through a certain place in the landscape. And then there's also hand-drawn maps, often kid-drawn. I think this one is not kid-drawn, but hand-drawn maps of the area. And then where you wind up is that you find a quest box. And in that lower right-hand image is it's a waterproof container. Inside there's a stamp pad. There is a carved stamp, a rubber stamp that has an image that relates to that spot. So, and if you're a Valley Quester, you have a little book of your own, and you collect stamped images from the boxes that you've found. You also have your own stamp that you stamp into a little book that's in the quest box. And there's usually some interpretive information in the quest box about the place you have been exploring around in. So this takes this combination of hunting and gathering and maps and paths and weaves them together into an interpretive experience. I only am going to give you this one fantasy example because I love it. This was a flower fairy program at the Mini Trista Cultural Center in Muncie, Indiana. This is on the grounds of what was the Ball Estate. It included 4 large old Victorian homes and beautiful Victorian gardens. And so they had a program, not a school-related program, and weekends or after-school program that was led by a dancer. And in the beginning, it was just for girls. And so in the beginning of the program, each girl had to go through the garden and choose a flower that she felt most attracted to. And then the idea was that each child became a flower fairy, the flower fairy that was related to that flower. And the dancer then helped the child develop a dance repertoire, a sequence of dance movements that was suggested by the character of the flower, right? So if you were a lily of the valley, you had kind of small gestures, and you hid, you darted around and hid, or you hid underneath other stuff. So then and this happened over the course of about 3 weeks. Then at the end of the program, it ended on midsummer's nights, right around the summer solstice. And there was an evening program in which the gardens were lit with candelaria, and families would wander through the gardens on the garden paths, and the flower fairies would perform. Completely charming idea. So the idea here is that all children fantasize, or lots of children fantasize about wanting to be fairies. So let's give them the opportunity. And in the process, they actually are learning botany and the virtue of biodiversity, because they're learning that each flower is different and has its own character. We'll stay on the fairy theme. I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. Last design principle is small worlds. Kids love small worlds. They want to construct them. Doll houses are small worlds. Miniature train arrangements are small worlds. Sandbox play is small worlds. So the building of fairy homes, all kids, or lots of kids, do this. So they're both interested in the fantasy of fairies, but they also like creating the small world. Fairy homes can expand into fairy worlds. So this is a big dock out to miniature fairy sailboats, and bridges for the fairies. Sandbox play is a good example of loose parts. Sand is a perfect loose part, but then also providing other kinds of loose parts makes sandbox play even better. And then I love this image of a small world in a garden. So an example of a program that's been developed out of this whole small worlds and fairies fascination are the Portsmouth Fairy House Festival, which happens every year. This past year it was more virtual, but it's been going on for 16 years. this is a little girl looking at a small world inside of a carved pumpkin. So I know a number of other organizations that have created fairy house programs as a way to engage kids and parents together. And there's both pre-made fairy houses, and then parents and kids get to build them together. So some examples from urban sites. This is the Imagination Playground, which is at the South Street Seaport, really tiny little piece of space that is incredibly popular. And its popularity is in great part a function of its use of the loose parts idea. And so all those blue things that you can see, there's a lot of kids and there's a lot of blue things. So the blue things come in these big crates, which are, crates of, they're kind of dense polystyrene, and that can be fitted together in lots of different ways. There's connectors as well. And so these guys will bring these kits of loose parts around to different playgrounds to engage kids in construction play. And I'm not going to say much about, these are just other images from the South Street Seaport. So some images from this jungle playground. The activities look kind of risky. And so there's this whole notion of thinking about liability, which of course everybody is always wondering about. The interesting, these play structures look risky for kids. And an interesting thing that's happened in Germany is that there's one large insurance company that insures a lot of different outdoor play spaces in the city. And they did actuarial research to discuss, and they found that children who had more active childhoods, who had more physically active childhoods, were less likely to have accidents as adults. And so they realized that the insurance companies realized they should fund moderately risky play elements in playgrounds so as to decrease the number of insurance claims that adults would file against them as when they got older. So moderate risk, there's the botanical garden in Richmond, Virginia uses the term safe danger. Moderate risk is a healthy thing for kids, because what we want to do is to train them to assess risk and be careful. I think I was going to show this last set of examples. I'll zip through it. I'm not even going to narrate this. You can just look at them and see them. This is a program at a public library in Mancos, Colorado, kind of a rural town, but a public library after school program in which a lot of things that I've been talking about were manifest. The library's objective was to create a foundation of stewardship and engagement and civic engagement through these activities. A lot of focus on if we're going to be outdoors after school, you got to have the right gear. So building snow shelters, just like the special places stuff we talked about before. Snowball fights as a valid activity. So many schools have gotten rid of snowball fights. Bringing in, the local sled dog guy, so the kids can interact with the sled dogs. This relates to the animal allies design principle, which I didn't talk about. And then winter water play, exploring frozen streams as an illustration of the adventure design principle. And there was also related to the kid program is suggested books for parents. And then these were the outcomes. They did a little evaluation. The kids ran to the library after school, of course, what every librarian wants. The kids were more relaxed and they slept better. There was interesting new friendship patterns as a function of it, and it was connecting kids to the local community and developing stewardship and citizenship values, hopefully. So the idea is investing in children's play and designing programs that allow for encourage play with parents and without parents, because that's what's healthiest for kids. And then I'm ending with a plug for my own book, Wild Play. This is my book about how I raised my own kids and all the different kinds of outdoor adventures we went on. And it's from early childhood to middle childhood to adolescence to adulthood.
Great. Thank you, David. So we do have a couple minutes for questions. So if you do have any burning questions, please do put them in the chat. David, I am glad you brought up the issue of liability, because we had a couple of questions come up in the chat about the practicalities of insurance with regard to these risky programs. And do you have any, for organizations who are thinking through that, any advice for them about how to think about that?
Yeah, it's you have to sometimes do a little bit of searching. If you're doing something that you think is more high risk than you're used to doing, and you want to do it, you might either have to work with your insurance agent or look around for other insurance companies that are less concerned about this physical liability issue. In general, I've looked at this a lot in relationship to nature preschools versus traditional preschools. And in lots of cases, there's fewer accidents in the woods when kids are doing kind of woods play than there are on playgrounds. So if you're having kids in the woods, it turns out that it's safer than having kids on playgrounds. So the actuarial research is such that a lot of these things are not actually more dangerous, or a lot of these things don't actually lead to more injuries, but we perceive them as such. So you have to figure out how to get past the perception that A, it's dangerous, and that B, risk is inappropriate for kids. I always say that we're always doing a risk-benefit analysis as parents, and we do it when we have kids play sports. So you have your kid playing soccer, you're doing a risk-benefit analysis. Soccer, kids get injured playing soccer, so that's the risk. But the benefits of physical exercise and learning to play on a team and all those other things, those benefits outweigh the risks. So we have to have the same kind of risk-benefit mindset in things, is that yes, there's a little bit of risk here, but is it constructive risk? And is it beneficial? And because eliminating all risk is counterproductive, because kids are implicitly wanted, there's without taking some kind of risk, there's not a lot of learning.
Great. Yeah, that's so true. I just have one more question before we go, which is coming from the chat, which is, a lot of times we're used to having those who program, we often program very structured programs. And I'm curious, these are a little bit more learner directed and a little more loosely organized programs. And I'm curious if you have any tips for how to set up and how to structure a program like that.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I always answer this question by saying, we were going to England. I'd spent all the time with my kids who were like, 9 and 6 or 10 and 7, reading about all the Arthurian legends, and we were going to go visit castles. And so we were in England, and we were going to go visit this castle, and I was really excited. And the kids were kind of moping around. I said, "Look, we're going to a castle. This is going to be really fun." And one of my kids said to me, "Do we have to go on a tour?" Right? And that encapsulates for me the problem in certainly with historic homes. I could go off on a rant about historic homes. I have a great book called, if anybody is in a historic home person, a great book called The Anarchist's Guide to Historic Home Museums, which means changing the mindset about historic homes. But the idea of the structured program turns off a lot of kids. So you have to have programs that that have some structure to them, but also have some kind of open-endedness to them if you're going to appeal to kids, right? So that, you can have a structured program where you do some walk and talk kind of stuff, but then you have some piece of it where you stop for a while and you say, okay, I'm going to talk to the parents, you kids can, if you want to go hang out over here by the, by the berry bushes, you can go do that. So providing that space so that there's a little bit of open-endedness is really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So David, we do have to wrap up. I know we're just about at 3 o'clock, but I do want to thank you so much for this conversation. I hope for all of you who come to listen that you've had hopefully gotten some good ideas and some inspiration to do programs out in nature with children and families coming up. So thank you so much. And one comment to share from the chat is that Bronson Alcott would be so proud, David. So
yes,
um,
right. I do know
so,
Bronson Alcott. Yes,
indeed,
he would be proud.
yes,
He
yes,
would agree.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so Susie and David, thank you again. This was wonderful. And thank you to all of our attendees. Just a quick reminder that we will be back next week at the same time, and we'll have a panel of community partners representing Beaver Brook Association in New Hampshire, Farrington Nature Link in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and Mass Audubon. And they'll be sharing with us a number of ways that they interact with families and children in the outdoors. So we hope you can join us.